So we're going to look at 3 examples of work that's going on here in BC that will illustrate some quite different aspects of development in a complex dynamic system and the developmental evaluation opportunities around that. I've asked each one of them to describe that effort in about 10 minutes, and then I'll make some brief comments to highlight the developmental evaluation aspects of it, or some of them, and then we'll look across all 3 of them and have a chance for you to ask questions either about those examples or further about developmental evaluation in general. So the first example is work that's going on about the introduction of new service standards particularly related to treatment centers. The second is work that's going on here around stigma reduction and some techniques that are intersecting around understanding the nature of stigma and its impact upon people. And the third is a center that's in development and being worked with on King Street. So you hear about each of those, quite different levels of engagement. One is provincial-wide, another is quite localized, and they'll give us some different insights into the nature of the developmental processes. So, Jane, are you going to open? If you'll introduce yourself then to folks.
Hi, everyone. My name's Jane Collins, and I'm the program manager on a provincial knowledge exchange initiative. It's funded through Health Canada, and it's called the Drug Treatment Funding Program. And as part, it's a knowledge exchange initiative. I just want to give you the kind of, to frame what the work we're doing and the discussion example of the standards, is that what we're funded to do is to build a knowledge exchange infrastructure that facilitates the implementation and support of evidence-informed practice and knowledge exchange activities, and fosters linkages across the system of substance use services and supports in BC. So big, long, giant, what does that mean? So just to kind of unpack that a bit, when we're talking about knowledge exchange, we've developed a kind of a common definition for us that really grounds us in the work we're doing. And we're talking about knowledge exchange as generally understood as a co-creation of situations, conditions, and ecologies that support a culture of shared learning through knowledge creation, translation, dissemination, uptake, and evaluation. And we're talking about what we mean by a knowledge exchange infrastructure is the tangible, tactile tools, structures, scaffolding, the space to do the work, and the people to move things forward. And in this work, it's a really lovely initiative that's province-wide. It involves all 6 health authorities. It's a shared stewardship initiative so that we have a provincial team that's made up of, we have knowledge exchange leads in each of the health authorities, and we have a co-management model with leaders involved across each health authority. And we work as a collective team. And we're connected at the provincial level. When this initiative came about, or the opportunity, it's really some of the leadership at the Ministry of Health recognizing that this is a unique opportunity to strengthen the substance use system, and let's involve the system in how we do this, and what our priorities are, and how we want to strengthen the system. And in one of the areas, it was a priority area that was identified was knowledge exchange to support residential treatments in BC. And as part of this work, we took a knowledge exchange approach to the development of standards for both, and the first year was the development of service standards and model for both adult and youth residential services, just released a couple months ago. And we're taking a developmental approach taking a knowledge exchange approach to support the implementation of those standards. And in this work, I just want to recognize Fraser Health's leadership in this. And so we have the co-stewardship across the province. And the leadership in Fraser Health, Sherry Mumford, is taking a leadership role in stewarding this with the provincial steering group involving folks from across the health authorities. And we're taking the knowledge exchange approach that we're doing is looking at these standards as really a base to support good practice and a base to support knowledge exchange and practice innovation. And we're really supporting a practice innovation approach or a spread of innovation approach in the work we're doing. And we're starting the introduction of these back into the field. So when we developed them, it involved the field in the development of the standards. So we had a provincial steering committee with expertise from across the province on this and across the service sectors to develop the standards. So we developed them with the field. And now we're using the same knowledge exchange approaches to support the implementation of the standards. So we're taking these things that were developed with the field back to the field, and we're introducing it using an appreciative inquiry approach. We've contracted with Dr. Glenn Grigg, who's going to be doing the initial work with us, to take an appreciative inquiry with the residential services across various settings in BC, because we don't have one type of residential service. We have residential services that are delivered across a variety of different settings and a variety of intensity of services. And so we're looking at taking a strength-based approach, an appreciative inquiry, to really engage the field in how the standards that they help create land in these particular settings, and opening the space of inquiry to really develop knowledge exchange tools and mechanisms to help support those standards being implemented, and also having the standards be a base for safe practice. It's not about standardizing treatment. It's providing a base standards that will support innovation and good practice. So that's the approach that we're taking with this. And we're starting out with I don't like the word pilot sites, but we're starting out with a representative sample of the different settings which residential services are supported or are delivered across the province in the initial inquiry. And we're going to be learning from that inquiry what innovations are out there in practice, how these standards are currently being met, and really it's going to be supporting both. We're coming at it it's not a traditional way to come about the support for the implementation of treatment standards. Normally, almost everywhere I've ever seen, implementation of standards means we have produced these standards. Now, we're going to implement them by focusing on compliance and monitoring. And thou shalt, and you will do these. And your funding will be, severely limited if you don't do these. We're not taking that approach. We will be looking at, the reality of monitoring to standards, but in a collaborative manner with the field and with the existing regulatory systems in BC that already do a lot of the base monitoring for quality control. We're talking about quality excellence, not focusing on bare minimum. We're focusing on here's the standards that will support safe practice, and here's a kind of a container for conversations that we can now support a community of practice in. So. And I want to just recognize, I didn't say this for filming, and also to recognize the leadership both across the province on the approach to this, because it started out, just a historical, do I have a couple minutes? It started out historically that we did a residential review of the services in BC, and as part of that review, we did it in a collaborative manner across the health authorities, and really developed a lot of relationships across health authorities and across services that helped us then move forward for the development of the work and development of the standards and how we're going to help support the implementation of those standards. And it's really strong leadership in mental health and substance use across the province that's taken this approach and supported this approach. I want to recognize that. And at the Ministry of Health level, Annette Harding and Diana Soko were the initial folks at the Ministry of Health involved in shifting how we do this. And Annette is now off at the Ministry of Children and Family Development. And Amanda Seymour from the Ministry of Health is continuing. She was involved in the development of the standards with Annette, the consultations in the community, and is at the ministry now working with our provincial team on helping the knowledge exchange to support these. And they've been recognized by the mental health and substance use leadership in the province as a new way to do standards, a new standard in developing standards and supporting the implementation of standards.
So a couple things I would highlight about this and its connection with developmental evaluation. The history piece, I began by talking about the importance of history and context. So there was a developmental process to get to the standards. Now this next phase is the introduction. And the very strategy for introducing the standards into the BC environment and the diverse kinds of treatment centers means that what's unknown is how these residential centers will react, how the staff will react. But what we do know in this kind of environment is that people will form impressions fairly quickly. They will start communicating those impressions to other service providers. There will be scuttlebutt that develops. Reactions will occur, some of which may be positive, some of which may be negative. People will form groups of views about how they feel about the standards and how they are reacting to them. And so that's the stuff that will emerge. And to be open to that in a non-compliance sense, but to see what happens, to monitor that, to get the reactions, to be able to dialogue about that and feed those reactions back to the people who are engaged will help inform the pace at which other people join the process, other residential centers begin to get engaged with this. And these kinds of processes can move very quickly, or they can move very slowly, or they can move in a dynamical way where for a while there's a lot of action, and then there's a consolidation period, and then there's a lot of action. And some of what will affect all that is what else is going on in the health system while this is going on, things that can't be anticipated. So it's in the face of that uncertainty and an engagement kind of process that's going to be informed by how the initial reception is that makes this a developmental process. And the methodological implications, which we haven't talked a lot about, is that you actually, to do this kind of work, need an emergent design. You can't lay out the entire evaluation data collection in advance because you have to create the evaluation data collection as the process itself unfolds. They don't know for sure how many residential centers they're going to be working with in the initial introduction, or how fast additional centers will come on stream and join the process, and at what level of intensity they will join it. So the evaluation design has to get created as the implementation unfolds, which is not the way most evaluations get designed. So that creates its own challenges methodologically and budget-wise to be able to make the evaluation match the process as it unfolds. A lot of agility, a lot of emergence, both on the intervention side and on the evaluation side. The second example Marika is going to share with us is about some work that they're doing around both stigma and a particular approach to working with a group of both therapists and their clients.
I'll use that picture too. I loaded it up. Hi everyone. Hi again. My name is Cassandra Lee, and I'm one of the knowledge exchange leaders that Jane mentioned in the project, and I work in Fraser Health. And I'm going to share with you kind of the whole, what we're developing right now, and why developmental evaluation approach is a good fit, is the whole idea about, and this could sound very familiar, Michael already mentioned it, about evaluation living in the projects. And within a system, there's several projects. So projects come flying at you, and if you're a clinician providing counseling or therapy in a health service such as mental health and addictions, things come firing at you, initiatives, projects, different changes, and it kind of looks like a lot of things that are coming at you, very siloed and sometimes working at cross purposes, and because we treat things as projects. So one of the things that we're learning a lot about was, for example, we'll start here with, how many people have heard of motivational interviewing? Let me put my glasses on. Okay, motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is an approach, it's a clinical approach that really helps align your clinical techniques in aligning yourself with a client to help a client who's ambivalent, who may be resisting change. So it helps kind of support that journey through ambivalence. And so there's a technique. It's very standardized. There's a model. It's called motivational interviewing. There's an actual motivational interviewing network of trainers. Is there any MINT trainers here? No? Okay, then I don't have to be as careful. No, I'm kidding. No, there's MINT trainers, so it's very regulated. You know, you get registered as a MINT trainer. So it's a model. It's a model of how to do motivational interviewing, and also a model on how you build capacity or bring that competency to clinicians. So in Fraser, and the jury's in, motivational interviewing, there is so much evidence to support that it actually reduces ambivalence. So no question that it has some effectiveness. So we in Fraser Health said, you know, we really need to go out and really get our workforce on board, get everyone trained in motivational interviewing so they'll start practicing motivational interviewing, because we know we have the most effect over someone's treatment, whether we're going to lead to better outcomes early in treatment and if we can retain them in mental health and substance use. So motivational interviewing, great response. So we decided before we would, you know, sign contracts with MINT trainers, bring them up here, get everyone through a MINT workshop, that we would really check out. We started hearing evidence, my colleagues in the audience too, Jen, she's an initiatives coordinator. We keep hearing some kind of rumblings from the context about change fatigue within our clinicians, feeling overworked, overburdened. The burden of someone's care is really, they're feeling it. So we went out and did a little bit of a collaborative inquiry. We got curious and put on our evaluative thinking hats around, okay, what is it like for clinicians? Like, what does ambivalence look like? What does resistance look like? When we went out to talk to clinicians, we heard things that we really weren't expecting. We couldn't really predict around what they were really up against. And it kind of, some of the words that used to describe it was moral distress. They felt they couldn't practice the way they intended, that there was work pressures, there were system constraints, all kinds of stuff was going on. So the very fact that we had a plan, an intended strategy to bring in MINT, and then we hear from folks that they're dealing with so many change fatigue, the context really wasn't supporting that, we decided that we would adapt. We would switch. We would not go, because really bringing in a model that has a gold standard, and we just push that model and get people just to pull up their socks and do this, is going to add to more moral distress, right? That's really a tough thing to do. So what we did is we adjusted and we moved over to a motivational dialogue, which incorporated some aspects of moral distress. We really looked at kind of a clinical positioning, some ideas around the values that people bring to their work. We really customized and really worked with the content that we work with is ever changing. So we're not going with a standardized model of training and motivational interviewing. Out of that as well, what came out is we decided to sustain, we have a huge workforce in Fraser Health. We're the largest health authority in Canada. And we have contracted agencies, we have direct services, huge. We have a huge workforce in mental health and substance use. To sustain this was really hard because, as we know, just going to a workshop and coming back does not guarantee practice change. A colleague of ours calls that the spray and pray that something changes, right? That doesn't work in most cases. So we decided, okay, there's all kinds of ways in which we can adapt this educational initiative around, or knowledge exchange around what would that be. We found out in the motivational dialogue that certain people, this really jived. They started championing things in their workplaces. There was something about motivational dialogue. It was the language, or it was the words, or it was the intention, or something hit really deep inside, and they started championing it. So you can see on this dialogue, we started tracking, or we started monitoring champions and their connections. So you can see before we started really adapting, not on the content of motivational dialogue, but on the people, the champions, you can see the connections. And of course, once again, you can see that that's a highly connected system that's not dependent on one person. On the far side, after we started adapting our interventions from learning from the champions, and you can see kind of the difference visually. The other interesting thing about the champions as well is that we didn't come up with a job description. This makes you a champion, do you measure up kind of thing, is that we learned from champions on what are they doing in their practice where they feel they're championing this. So we have a list. Some people are just doing it to model. Some people are facilitating weekly staff meetings where they just have an agenda item. They say on an agenda item, they ask the question, rather than starting in a case management meeting, what problem clients do you have, and what solutions do we need to get this person to take their meds, or this person is relapsing and needs to leave, like the problem-oriented kind of solutions. In a motivational dialogue spirit, it would be more of, what did you learn from your clients today, and how does that change you as a professional? To start that dialogue. It's a whole other area of inquiry that opens up a lot of space on really how we can be very creative and innovative. So champions some were facilitating those, some were practicing motivational dialogue, some were teaching, some were mentoring, some were coming up with great visual strategies to talk about this to leadership. So we got a whole list of different activities champions were doing, and we keep learning more and more what that is. And then now champions are creating their own avatars. So this month I can be this, this, and this, and next month I can be this, this, and this. So we've got about 66 champions right now. These champions now, of course, are championing other things, and I'm going to say a little bit more about the stigma piece here. So that's one project, but of course, that project kind of leaks out into other areas, right? Things are dependent on each other. I'll go to the next one. Thanks, Michael. The stigma radar. So while we were doing this, of course, in motivational dialogue, as some of you know are interviewing, there's a certain spirit that drives motivational interviewing, and it really is this whole concept that you learn from your client. You position yourself differently with your client, that your client isn't something you do things to. You don't work one-on-one with somebody. You work one-to-one. There's a shift, right? That also starts challenging your core beliefs on how you see clients, or the whole idea about negative experiences. So we started looking at stigma on a large scale. And stigma is one of those words or concepts, I think that's the most overused and misunderstood word. It's something that means different things to different people at different times. So in most stigma reduction or prevention initiatives, we treat stigma as an independent variable. We look to reduce stigma, right? We look to reduce or measure the amount of stigma. That is such an elusive chase because it's one of those things that is Michael uses the term a sensitizing concept. It is something, sometimes we're working with concepts like stigma or standards in Jane's case that really means different things to different people at different times. And it's more about the development here the development is really the development of stigma. What is stigma? And rather than treating stigma as a variable that you reduce, we're looking at stigma as a port of entry to kind of inquiry that can reveal ways in which we can intervene to contribute to something that leads to better outcomes. So there's a shift there in how that's done. We just realized that yesterday after conversations with Michael. But anyways, I I just had to say it out loud. It makes sense to me now. I don't know about you guys. But anyways, one of the cool things that came out of this, so I wanted to illustrate what it's really hard with stigma, because when we went to our leadership, and how many people have worked on stigma work before? Any kind of stigma reduction work? We need to talk, you guys. But the thing is, don't you find, I remember stigma is one of those things where it is so influenced by historical practices and opinion. So whenever you get a group of people together to do a think tank around stigma, people have ways in which they've been experienced a project. We do it this way. This is the way we've always done it. You're shaking your head in the back. I know that. Or this is somebody's opinion. Let's do it this way. I saw these glossy posters and these information sheets, and I saw this campaign on TV, or I saw this movie star say something. Like, it's a very provocative kind of nature to it, and everyone has an opinion of some groovy, cool thing that we can do. The issue is that there isn't a lot of evaluation around stigma about what's really effective. And the reason isn't, and there's been attempts, I think the reason is that it's one of those things that traditional evaluation can't measure. It's a sensitizing concept. It's really hard to do. We did do now before, this really shows this, when we were out planning, and I don't know if Cheryl's still here, but in one of the communities we were working with too, is that historical practices and opinion leaders really dominated the conversation. We did a word grid. We did some participant observation, and we really looked at the discussions that were happening, and we plotted the key, kind of topics that people were talking, what the decisions were, and all the decisions we made in our plan were being dominated by opinion leaders or historical practices. We did do a systematic review of the evaluation of stigma reduction in substance use, and then we plotted, after we introduced the systematic review, what was influencing the decision making. One of the key factors, and you can see that after the review, and we introduced the review, that historical practice opinion kind of became less influential. It's not so much that that's the bullet there. That's not the answer. That's not the answer. What's different now is they have a different way of talking about stigma. There's 3 levels of stigma that you can talk about. You can get more explicit about it. Those aren't the answers. It's a way it's treated as a sensitizing concept, so people can talk about it in a more explicit way. And it opens up more opportunities, more of those ports of entry where you can look at. One of the ways that we're doing that now, too, is that we are looking at, remember, I'm bringing back motivational dialogue, is that rather than go out and do stigma reduction project, what we're doing is we're weaving it onto existing projects and initiatives in a very deliberate way. So the motivational dialogue, what's happening now is that, remember I mentioned we included some acceptance and commitment therapy work in that. That's also indicating that doing that kind of work really starts getting people to question their core beliefs of who they are and how they position themselves with clients and things like that. We're just going to fortify some of that in our motivational dialogue, and we're going to weave. So it's kind of a coevolution of all the projects that are now looking at this kind of stigma as a port of entry for those topics. So for example, in motivational dialogue, we are working with UBC in their medical school. We do motivational interviewing workshops with them, and we're really focusing a lot on kind of stigma and what it means to them as a sensitizing concept, and kind of looking at a port of entry for inquiry. So we're kind of developing the whole concept of stigma as a port of entry for good work.
Thank you. A couple things I would highlight here. One of the things that shows up in a lot of systems change work and around emergence are changing networks and the way that things and people relate to each other. So social network theory and social network mapping tools become a major method of tracking how systems are unfolding and how systems change is unfolding. This is a nice example of that. And these networks tend to be dynamical in that they don't simply grow in one direction. They flow in and out of degrees of activity, so that the understanding the degree of activity of a network and how it's changing is quite different than expecting it to just get more and more of something, that it's an increased quantity of something. They actually are very dynamic, and some of what you heard in Marika's story is the way that a network that begins to engage one thing will end up intersecting other things that are going on. So that her story is a story of two different things that people are working on beginning to intersect and combine, and that becomes a developmental opportunity that gets tracked with developmental evaluation. A lot of stuff that's unfolding in her story. This notion of sensitizing concept takes us back to the beginning point I was making about language. Language matters, how we label things, how we understand things. One of the more powerful examples of that comes from the experience with the Maori people. They're working with a health innovation where their transition over a period of 40 years is captured by 3 different adverbs. In the beginning, the health system in New Zealand did health work to the Maori. And then they moved to a place of doing it with the Maori. What they're currently experimenting with is an innovation of engaging in healthcare as Maori. From to with to as. And those little adverbs represent total paradigm shifts about the relationships, the identity, the engagement, and their entire developmental evaluation project, it's in its 3rd year now, is exploring, doing case studies of interviewing people, tracking network development around what does it mean to undertake wellness as Maori. Lot to unpack there. And so this is a common kind of developmental piece is people getting inside what something means and see how it evolves as different perspectives come to bear on it. And this 3rd example you're going to hear has elements of applying different ways of engaging and thinking in a quite concrete setting. So we've looked at a couple of big province-wide initiatives. Now we're going to get down to the action in a particular location with a specific group of people. The King Street example. Tara and Ray, are you joining? Yeah. All right. If you all introduce yourselves and that work.
Hi there. My name is Tara Mochizuki, and I'm with the Addiction Knowledge Exchange program. And I'm a project lead, and my focus is on primary care capacity building and also medication-assisted therapies. One of the projects that we've been working on, though, began as my master's project. And I started with a conversation, really, between myself and Ray, who will introduce herself after. And we started with this small idea of, we had this location, it was a mental health and substance use center, and it was being sort of underutilized. There was a bunch of people that were sort of plunked into this location, but they didn't really have a common purpose, and they were just providing services that they had always provided there, because we needed space at the other building, quite honestly. And so basically what we did, it was a great location. It's a house, and it's open, and it's a really welcoming kind of an atmosphere. And what we realized as we had this conversation was that we needed to do something with this. And we didn't really know what we wanted to do with it. And so we began a process of talking to people. Really just sort of sitting down and having conversations with people. And we talked to some of the people that we worked with, our counselors and our case managers, and we talked with our psychiatrists and some of our other specialists. We talked to our community partners. So people that looked at housing for people with mental health and substance use issues, people that looked at doing more life skills-based things with people with mental health and substance use issues. And we sort of sat down, and we also talked with physicians, and that was one of our pivotal sort of relationships that carried on the conversation, because what we discovered was that our psychiatrists and the physicians in our community had been trying to come up with a way to deliver health care to people with mental health and substance use issues for a long time. And hadn't really come up with a solution for that, hadn't figured out a way to make it work. And so we actually had a bit of a unique opportunity, and I wasn't part of the drug treatment funding project at that point, but Ray was. And I think it was really the funding opportunity, but also the spirit of the drug treatment funding project, which allowed us to sort of think a bit more creatively, and allowed us to think about the partnerships and the relationships, and so we sort of used that. And so we began to co-create a model, and it continues to evolve as we go along, it continues to emerge. And what we wanted to do is provide wraparound care for people with mental health and substance use issues, and focusing on those people who have really complex care needs. And so we focused on a couple of different things. We thought we were creating a model, but what we realized today was that we were actually using some key principles. And those were that we wanted to have the client at the center of everything that we did. And so all of the services needed to be relevant for the people that we were providing services to. The other thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to really build on that atmosphere that we already started with, that welcoming atmosphere and that openness, where people could feel really safe and really comfortable. And so, we took down glass and little holes that people had to speak through, and we unlocked locks and opened doors, and we painted and made things bright, and just really sort of opened up that welcoming space. And then the other thing that we really focused on was the relationships. Because as I went and talked to people, and as Ray went and talked to people, what we discovered is that people wanted to have an atmosphere where they could have fun, and where they could work as a team, and where they could really rely on the other people in their space to have their back, and to know that they were going to sort of be there and to just sort of share the environment and the experience. And so, when we first began, everybody told us that we would never be able to get physicians to work with us, that physicians didn't really want to work with people that had that complexity of issues, and we would never be able to find them. They're just too busy, blah, blah, blah. There was a whole bunch of different reasons. And we are amazed, I think, still daily, to know now that we have actually 14 physicians who come through our clinic and work different shifts and really want to be a part of this, and actually really want to work with people that everybody told us they wouldn't want to work with. And so I think that those are just the pieces that I wanted to talk about, and then I'm going to pass it to Ray, who will talk a little bit about some of our learnings.
Why don't you tell this story first?
Oh, about Dawn?
Tell Dawn's story.
Oh, okay. I'm going to tell you a bit about Dawn. Dawn was one of the clients that we talked to early on in the process. And this is a fellow who had been in a federal institution for a lot of years. I think it was about 12 years. He has addiction issues, with his drugs of choice being crack cocaine and heroin. He has spent much of his time when he's not in prison on the streets. And lots of our community service providers, we get lots of calls about him from the RCMP, all these kinds of things. And he and I sat down and talked one day. And he told me one of the most sort of impactful statements that I've ever heard. He said, "You know what? I realize that my addiction causes me all sorts of consequences. I sometimes don't have housing. I often don't have great clothes. I oftentimes don't have food. But when I'm sick, I should be able to get health care." And so it was kind of this really neat moment to realize that what I thought of as basic needs, he realized that he could go without, but he couldn't get access to a doctor and health care, and that was what I needed to be working towards. So it's one of the things that was kind of changing for us.
So I won't add a ton because I know we're getting late in the evening, but I guess one of the things that was so affirming today to spend the day with Michael was to really give some language to what we had been doing intuitively, and what we really, I think, felt was maybe not unsupported, but certainly not in sync with our organization. So we were trying to be innovative, trying to be responsive, and trying to co-create rather than sort of creating a model and inviting people in before. Because everyone we talked to, particularly physicians, said that failed for them. It didn't meet their needs. They didn't want to be invited in after the fact, and they weren't interested. And so it was really just great to start to get some language for this work and this way of working. And things like the example that Tara shared of Dawn's story, to be able to see that, Michael helped us today to talk about that as a critical case example, and to be able to, and maybe that's the wrong phrase, but that's what I'm going to call it. Is that right? Good. Okay. But just really that even though that is a sample of one, that there's lots of learnings and lots of ways to test that out and be able to use Dawn's experiences as a way of centering and asking questions of other folks that will use our service, if that rings true for them, if that resonates for them. So it's been really an evolving learning with lots of feedback and lots of adaptation as we've gone along. We're very, very early days, but we hadn't really found a way to kind of measure this as we went. And one of the other things that was great validation was support for the notion that Tara, as the kind of lead of this process and the person responsible for its evaluation, that there was nothing wrong. In fact, there was everything right about having her immersed in that setting, to be able to learn it, to feel it, to adapt, to ask the questions, and to have those opportunities to talk to the Dawns of the world, because as in another approach, that wouldn't have ever been created. So it's been a very satisfying and rich experience, and we're just really thankful for the opportunity to better understand what we're doing.
Thank you all. One of the things I would call your attention to in each of these examples that is controversial and gets to the heart of this kind of work and developmental evaluation matching it is that a traditional evaluation approach in each of these cases would have begun by not only asking but demanding that these folks pre-specify exactly how things are going to turn out. So that in the example that we just heard, they would be asked, well, how many doctors will be working with you? And they'd make up a number, because there's no basis for saying we're going to get 14. So they would say 20, 10, pull a number out of the air or some bodily orifice. And then this becomes a criterion against which you're judged, because there is no basis for making up such numbers. It's going to be emergent. It's going to be the basis of the relationship. And likewise with the standards piece, how fast are you going to move, and what are going to be the performance indicators of whether people are adopting and complying with the standards. Those kinds of traditional questions actually interfere with the process. They don't support it, they interfere with it. They become barriers to learning and the unfolding with it. So these end up being different ways of engaging with change, and the evaluation is aimed at being supportive to that way of engaging, not without controversy on either the implementation or the evaluation side, but finding a match between those ways of going about things. Let me open it up for your questions about any of the examples or any of the other things that we've talked about, or if there's something that we haven't talked about that you want to add to the mix, you're welcome to do that. The microphones are yours. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Eva Wadolna, And I would like to ask you a question. What's really wrong with using quantum physics approach in saying that observer affects what is happening? Because this is basically what you're talking about.
That's right.
So I would like you to answer what's wrong with being explicit about it and using noetic sciences as a base for evaluation.
As your question suggests, that is exactly what's going on here. The folks that criticize that are operating from a worldview where evaluation is separate from the intervention, and where the very kind of effects that you're talking about are considered a problem rather than the way the world is. So, for example, those of you who've had measurement courses, design courses, know that there are very expensive and elaborate designs aimed at measuring instrumentation effects, because when people take pretests, they learn from the pretests, and therefore that learning is supposed to get separated out from their actual learning in the program. And that's considered a problem because you don't know when you get the post-test how much of the post-test result is what they learned from the pre-test and how much is from the experience of the program. That's considered a problem if your question, if the evaluation question is just what was the added value of the program apart from the pre-test. But based on what you just said, if we hear that and say the problem is that people are learning from the pre-test, and then you say, wait, people are learning from the pre-test. What if we turn that on its head and say, how do we support that learning? How do we use that learning? How do we increase that learning and acknowledge that learning so that the evaluation process is understood as part of the system? That observing something and having people engage with it becomes part of the intervention, and therefore when we go to report the results, we can't disentangle them because they are indeed connected. There are some cost-benefit side to that, because you're actually having the cost of evaluation support the change process rather than just gathering data and reporting data. And that's one of the ways that I find policymakers will sometimes come to embrace this. And going back to the earlier point before the break about this work being done in Africa, I find that many of the folks working in developing countries embrace developmental evaluation because they can't afford to have evaluation done as an end in itself. So to have evaluation contribute to development, partly through reactivity, partly through instrumentation effects, partly through the reflective process, that makes sense to them in scarce environments where to have somebody whose only job is to come in and write a report about what went on and doesn't contribute in any way to the development process, many of them consider that borderline unethical and a waste of resources. So again, in terms of where some of the folks are coming to this, they're coming from it because they recognize these interaction effects and can deal with it. But it's very controversial, and it's not the dominant view. Another question or comment? Here comes one.
My name is Barry Schatz. I'm with the BC Yukon Association of Drug War Survivors, Fraser Health Region, Abbotsford Chapter. I have no formal education whatsoever. Stigma and discrimination, to me, tend to come together somehow. And it's a dilemma to me when healthcare providers have high professional and high moral standards that prevent them from meeting a person where they're at. Part of the effort to break things down, to communicate and build rapport and trust with an individual, which would allow them to communicate from the heart, can be very problematic when a person's sitting up tall and straight, looking down with very clean and starch-type clothing. It's a intimidating type presentation that reduces the chance that this communication can even begin. So I hear these efforts, and it impresses me, and I hear these efforts, and it impresses me, and I hear these efforts, and it impresses me, and I'm waiting for it to dribble down to those that are working in the trenches to allow it to happen. But I also understand that there's a very large shortage of money to provide services. So if there isn't some type of grading type tactic used to empty the waiting rooms, whether it be uncomfortable seats, an unwelcome atmosphere, it's a problem. The last conference I was at with Fraser Health was the one about bringing mental health and addictions together, that people in the most vulnerable and marginal positions suffer from both, and that you can't address one or the other without bringing them both together. And I was overwhelmed. It's just a no-brainer. It's so obvious. Again, I wait for this to dribble to the bottom. And I have to point out that Drug Survivors Abbotsford chapter is deeply engaged with Fraser Health at this moment. But it's not addictions, and it's not mental health. It's disease control. Disease control understands and realizes the value of working with a drug user organization. I'm waiting for addictions and mental health to approach us. I'd really be impressed with Simon Fraser, because we have become the largest group of organized drug users out of the downtown east side, and the largest chapter of the Drug Survivors in British Columbia. We boast 450 in a community of Abbotsford, aka murder capital, aka disease central. 450 drug users organized in a community that has a bylaw that makes harm reduction illegal. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. And that very powerful reflection on things is at the core of this developmental process that we've been talking about tonight. And you're illustrating the challenges of systems change, the barriers to systems change. It's frustrating that things take a long time. The continuing to tell the story, engage with it, look at the consequences of things that go on. I just got a report from a program in Detroit. The American healthcare system is quite a mess. I mean, if you want to make yours look good, look at ours. And where the services are so bad around people in poverty and homelessness, that they got a pilot program that was doing some of the wraparound stuff that Tara and Ray were talking about, and creating a welcoming environment. But the only people who were eligible for those services were people living with HIV. And so they were a group of young African American men who went out and contracted HIV so that they could get those services. The only way they could be eligible, they weren't eligible for services just because they were homeless. You were only eligible for those degree of intense services if you were living with HIV. And so they decided to get HIV. I mean, the ways in which we get these convoluted incentives and the difficulties of looking at the whole system. Part of what you were hearing in the story from Tara and Ray is that, as you were describing, the welcoming environment, the nature of the chairs, what's on the walls, that's all part of the treatment. It's not just what happens in the hour of a counseling session. You've described an entire holistic experience as a person. And that's what brings us to to this kind of conversation. An evaluation is a part of that, because evaluation separates this stuff out. The only thing they're going to look at is the hour in which you're in a counseling mode, and you're saying, but it's a whole experience of being there from the time I walk in, and the people that I network with, and the people, how I identify myself. You've clearly got a very strong identity with the people in that network who've come through the kind of challenges that you've come through. Keep telling that story, and that's part of at least from this perspective, the change occurs, is to get people to understand these larger connections that you live, and that the professional world and evaluation world tends to separate and categorize and put boxes around. We need that insight, so thank you very much for sharing it. We've got time for maybe one more. If anybody has a final burning question? Bill?
I'm Bill Beattie, and I work in the Fraser Valley at one of the local universities, and I've been involved in evaluative efforts for a number of years. Michael, one of the things that has been a concern with our developmental evaluative activities is how we actually talk about information and results. So we've gotten more and more heavily into issues of storytelling. But again, not just storytelling that focuses on very specific interactions and results. Can you provide us with any information about individuals that have been involved in that or are working on it? It's a place that we'd really like to work on developing a little more.
A great question, because part of one of the examples you heard from Ray and Tara was giving the example of a story, in very abbreviated form, which we called a critical case that gives insights to things. And the narrative structure of story very much connects with developmental evaluation, because stories tell the unfolding of something. There's some beginning, which is in evaluation jargon, the baseline, and then there's some activity that happens, and then there's some conclusion at somewhere along the line. And the patterns of that unfolding and that development and understanding those patterns and the themes across them is part of the way people throughout time have made sense of their world. And putting those stories in context and having them evolve. Now, part of the challenge of storytelling and your story about what it's like to experience an intake process or an interview process with somebody who is clearly in a different space and is coming across different, and how do you trust that person with your story? We spent a lot of time today talking about issues of trust and relationship, and this gets to another one of the sacred areas of evaluation, the developmental evaluation challenges around the authenticity of the story and how you create a safe place to get authentic stories. One of the kinds of data on the baseline that is sacred in evaluation is the intake data, the data that you gather from somebody at the point of entry into a program. And then that becomes baseline, and you look at changes against that baseline. In a year, in 2 years, a person is going through therapy or substance abuse or whatever. And of course, you can't manipulate that baseline because that's the basis of comparison. But what we have learned, and your story is an illustration of that, and people who work and get to know clients, is that at the moment of intake, there is no relationship that would give people a reason to tell you the truth about their situation. And so in the programs I work with, like an employment program for chronically unemployed men of color, they have learned that it takes 6 to 9 months before a person trusts them enough to tell them what their actual baseline situation was. And that if you treat that initial story as the true story, and then you follow somebody along, that in many cases where they end up at the end of 2 years is where they said they were at the beginning, but were not. And it looks like no change has occurred because they hadn't shared just how dire their situation was. Because they sense that there are criteria that will keep them from getting care if they fully reveal the extent of either their substance abuse or mental health issues or family relationships. And so folks learn to disguise those kinds of things. And this can happen on a quite dramatic level. Today itself, I had just a couple minutes between the afternoon and evening sessions to check email, and there is a American Evaluation Association forum going on about discussing issues of this very question of how do we get good data to understand patterns and use stories to go to scale. And Elmer Shalimsky, who's former president of AEA and one of the great pioneers in the field, talked about a RAND Corporation study of prisons in California that was describing the conditions in California that were really very, very shocking and led to a lot of newspaper attention and some policy work. And it only turned out, as this got more and more attention, that the stories were all made up by the prisoners who had agreed to test the naivete of the researchers. And had conspired together to exaggerate. It's not that the prisons were lovely places to be, but they, in fact, ran a con on these researchers who came in looking exactly the way you described them, starched shirts, sit up tall, and said, tell me about what it's like in prison. Oh, I'll tell you some stories. And of course, they're titillating. You know, they're exaggerating things that are already bad, but they're playing games. So a core piece of what we come back to in this developmental piece, and you heard it in all 3 of the BC stories, is that stories are embedded in relationships. They don't just hang out there. You just don't show up someplace and say, tell me your story. And folks don't have any context for that, and they don't know who you are and what you're going to do with their story and how it's going to be put together with other pieces. So a part of a developmental evaluation inquiry with a group of people is creating the conditions for authentic story sharing and including the people who are sharing their stories in interpreting what they mean. Developing that understanding together and coming to value the shared process of making sense of things out of the inquiry. And of course, one of the things that we've learned back to the reactivity and the instrumentation effects is that the questions we ask in soliciting a story affects the story. People put together things in telling a story with a good qualitative interview that they hadn't put together before. They start connecting the dots. They bring some coherence to their story. And that can be a part of what they get out of it. And when they get the opportunity to hear other people's stories and start to think about what are the patterns in story, then we're, again, both getting insight into a developmental process, but the very collecting of stories changes the process, has an impact on the process, increases intentionality, increases awareness. I've worked in a lot of settings where people who get a chance to hear other people's stories have the impact on them of not being isolated, of not being alone anymore. And so it's an area where there's a lot of work, where there's some new ways of trying to make sense of stories and of treating that as a fundamental building block of development, and allowing people with deeper insight over time to revise their stories. So part of developmental evaluation is creating the legitimacy under careful conditions to go back and change the baseline, because the baseline's actually false. What people were willing to share and able to share at that moment in time did not represent their reality. And in some cases, in fact, a lot of cases, we don't even know how to tell the story about that early piece, because until people have experienced a program and learned some of the concepts and ways of talking about what their experience is, they couldn't have reported that at the beginning, because they didn't have an understanding of what they'd even been through and what had happened to them. That's retrospective baseline work. It's very controversial, but it means that stories themselves are emergent. They're not just there in whole cloth. They're not there because you go and ask somebody for their story. It may not be formed yet. It's still developing. And this kind of collaborative process becomes a part of that. So let me close with a story. It's one of my favorite metaphors that comes from what is sometimes considered the first novel in Western literature, and that is the story of Don Quixote from Cervantes that became the stage play Man of La Mancha. And I need to acknowledge that I suffer from the evaluation version of the intern disease, where interns think they have whatever disease they're studying in medical school at a moment in time. Everything for me is an evaluation story. So I'm afflicted with that evaluation disease. So you may not have realized it before, but Don Quixote is an evaluation story. It's a great evaluation novel. And basically, the story in Don Quixote, which is at the heart of evaluative thinking that permeates all forms of evaluation, and is in the Genesis story and is in this invitation to the dark side, is evaluation is about what is real, what is authentic, how do we know what's going on, how do we make sense of things in a chaotic world, and whose version of reality holds sway with what consequences. Because Don Quixote is a story of different versions of reality. In the play version of this, in Man of La Mancha, as Don Quixote is this elderly farmer who's retired, very parochial, hasn't seen much of the world, and gets the opportunity to read. Cervantes says he reads from morning till night and night till morning about the larger world and the things that go on in the world, until, as he learns about the many horrible things that have happened across the world, Cervantes says he gives up the melancholy burden of sanity. It's a lovely phrase, I think, for those of us in this work. He gives up the melancholy burden of sanity and conceives the project of becoming a knight errant, riding through the world, making the world a better place, also known as a social innovator. And in doing so, as he encounters and attempts to change things and runs into problems, his version of those problems turns out to be different than some other people. He thinks he's doing battle with a giant. Other people see it as a windmill. He thinks he's doing battle with an army. Others see it as a herd of sheep. He thinks he's rescuing a fair damsel. Others see her as a common prostitute not worth helping. And his son-in-law and his daughter are embarrassed by this madman riding through the countryside, hallucinating and trying to make the world a better place. And they conceive of a plot to trick him back into their reality, which they succeed in doing, bring him home, and he is near death in having given up his mission and purpose to accommodate their view of the world. And on his deathbed, as if to console him, they say to him, "At least you'll die in touch with reality." And he responds in a great evaluation monologue, great evaluation Broadway monologue, in touch with reality, knowing life as it is. I've lived for many years now, and I've seen life as it is. Pain, misery, cruel beyond belief, I've now encountered. I've been, as he moves back into that other state, he says, I've been a soldier and a slave. I've held my comrades at the last moment, dying in agony. These were men who were in their last moments. No glory, no brave last words, only the look of despair in their eyes, questioning why. I don't believe they were asking why they were dying, but why they had ever lived. Who knows where madness lies? Perhaps to be too practical is madness. To surrender one's dreams, that may be madness. To seek treasure where there's only trash. But maddest of all is to see life only as it is and not also as it could be and should be. Social innovation is about seeing life as it could be and should be. Evaluation is about seeing life as it is, seeing reality. And what we're doing in developmental evaluation is merging that enterprise to support moving life as it is closer to life as it should be and could be. Bringing basic reality testing, evaluative thinking into this enterprise of sharing perspectives, trying to sort out perspectives, trying to figure out what's going on, not as an end in itself, not to say we did evaluation, but the ultimate test of moving towards life as it should be. And so I hope that the day comes when you don't have to wait anymore to see that. And when your colleagues and peers and friends see systems changing in ways that represent that Don Quixote kind of dream about the way the world ought to be. And at its best, evaluation contributes to that. That's our contribution to systems change and in partnering with social innovation to be part of making life as it is closer to life as it could be and should be. Thank you for spending your evening ruminating with us on these things. I appreciate it very much. Good night.